Everybody, Peter Zeihan here, just taking a walk after this guy dumped on us. The big news today, it's February the 5th, is that overnight local time, Iranian-backed militants in Syria attacked another U.S. base. This is the first significant attack since those 3 American soldiers were killed early part of last week. And the United States launched a bunch of retaliatory strikes against Iranian-backed militias throughout the region. Anyway, this is the first significant action by them since, and again, it looks like a drone got through and hit the barracks again. This time, it wasn't American service people who were killed, but a half a dozen Kurds that U.S. Special Forces were training. Let me explain how we got into the Middle East and why it's difficult to get out, and then we'll put this into context. So, going back roughly, very roughly, 1,000 years, the Middle East has not been a place that anyone wanted to be. It was on the way somewhere. So you had your more advanced, somewhat, very loosely using this term, technocratic societies with a little higher value add in their economic systems in the West. And then you had East Asia, and to a lesser degree, Southeast Asia and South Asia, that produced goods that you could not find in the West, things like spices and porcelains and silks. And so the trick was to figure out how you could link these two economic systems together despite the vast distances involved. And from roughly 1000 to roughly 1500 AD, the solution was coastal vessels, camels, caravans. The problem with all of those things is you had to go through any number of intermediaries, especially for the land routes. And since the sea routes weren't safe, most people stuck with the land routes. This meant that the folks who lived in between, in the middle, to the east of the Western nations, there go the name, found themselves having to pay massive markups because you'd send your gold east and you'd bring the cargo west, and every few miles or few dozen miles, there would be another middleman who would take their cut. And so the cost of these products didn't double or triple or quadruple, but typically went up in cost by a factor of 1,000 or so. And so what were not necessarily everyday goods, but not exactly considered exotic goods out east, became the cream of the luxury goods in the West. And so the trick was to how do you avoid those markups? The solution was hit upon by the Spanish and the Portuguese, who developed the technologies to sail farther from the shore. With old coastal vessels, if you happened to anchor, which you had to do every night, within sight of land, there was a reasonable chance that somebody who lived in the neighborhood was just going to come and take your ship and kill your people and take all your stuff. So that's one of the reasons why they tended to prefer the land routes. But with the Portuguese and the Spanish developing deep water navigation, they were able to do an end run around that entire thing, interfaced directly with the east. And so from roughly 1500 until roughly 1900, the Middle East just didn't matter. It became a complete backwater, and eventually the Western countries industrialized, and when they came back to the Middle East, to an area that had not industrialized, you bring a knife to a gunfight enough times, and the locals pay attention. And so you basically had the Brits, the French, and the rest divvy up the entire region into mandates and colonies. Now, why was the West able to pull that off when the Middle East just kind of stayed at the same technological level? To be perfectly blunt, the answer is rainfall. Throughout the Western countries in Europe, it rains. Rain means that you can grow crops in any number of areas, and that gives people an interest in pursuing their own economic destinies. Also, you had winter in most of those areas, so in the off-season, farmers could be working on something else. They weren't exactly getting law degrees, but the point is the overall skill level of the population steadily creeped up. And when you've got a lot of people who are vested in stability in the system, even if it's not a democracy, you get a degree of political stability, economic advancement, technological acumen that you just don't get in the Middle East. In the Middle East, very few places have rain. Where you do have water, it's in a relatively narrow band, either right on the coast or along a river. And that makes it very, very easy for a political authority to rise and dominate that specific geography, and in doing so, basically reduce the entire population to slave status. That does not give people a lot of interest in pursuing stability for the system. It makes revolutionaries very popular, but it also means that the power of the state is just almost total. making it very, very difficult for anyone to make something of themselves. So you will get centers of learning throughout the Middle East who did absolutely preserve the Western knowledge during the Dark Ages, but they never applied it themselves. They never disseminated it within their own cultures. They were basically just libraries maintained by monks. Oversimplification, 1,500 years of history, I recognize that. But you can't deny the economic trajectory of the Middle East versus the West. And then once the West cracked the code on industrial technologies and they started having gunpowder and cannon, and the Middle East was left behind, there was no contest at all. So now, today, the economies of the Middle East matter more to the world today than they have for most of the last half millennia, largely because of oil, because there is an asset those industrial economies need in order to function. Now, this isn't so much an American problem directly because North America is self-sufficient, well, not even self-sufficient in oil, it's a significant exporter of oil. And if the Middle East were to vanish tomorrow, we'd have some adjustments on things like crude quality, but within a couple of years, we'd be totally fine. However, the Europeans, significantly less so, specifically since the Russian crude is no longer part of their equation. Okay, now where does that bring us? Well, it means that anyone who goes into the Middle East after about 1950 is faced in a very different environment from what was faced from 1000 AD to 1500, when it was just a place you had to push through, or from 1500 until roughly 1950, when the West was industrialized but the Middle East wasn't. Now the Middle East is. And no one's going to say that a group like ISIS in Syria is like the pinnacle of human technology, but it's really easy for them to get explosives and AK-47s. So it's no longer a contest like we saw from 1900 to 1950 between an industrialized Western imperial system and a completely non-industrialized, almost tribal Middle Eastern system. You've got a different makeup now. Now, the governing systems of the Middle East themselves are also in play and very much in flux, because before 1950, you basically had a series of what could be best called fortress political systems, where by a dint of geography, maybe they had an oasis like Damascus, maybe they were surrounded by desert like Egypt, maybe they were a mountain fastness like Iran. It's a little difficult to get in and out, and some of these areas are a lot more difficult to conquer than others, Iran probably being at the top of that list. But you introduce industrial technologies to this area in the post-colonial, post-World War II environment, and all of a sudden, they're not just drilling for oil, they're building roads, they're buying military hardware, and it makes for a very different mix. You get this incredibly brittle, top-down, concentrated political system that is absolutely incapable of providing the people with a level of technological progress that is possible elsewhere in the world, because there's very little to work from aside from cash, from oil. And you apply that in a world where society is weak. And the result, you get lots and lots and lots and lots of militant groups. And if you want to back one versus the other or one versus government, that's fine. But even if you win and the militant group overthrows the government, well, then what? You've taken what little order exists in an area and it's turned into chaos. You get complete societal breakdown, as we've seen in places like Egypt and Iraq and Syria in recent years. So, enter the United States. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration felt that the best way to fight al-Qaeda was to make sure that the countries that allowed al-Qaeda to function would go after it. So after the Afghan operation, we discovered that al-Qaeda scattered to the winds, and we found out that a lot of the recruits were coming from Syria, because that was how the Syrians got rid of their own dissidents. A lot of the troops, Taliban troops that were in Afghanistan, fled through Iran to parts unknown, because the Iranians were like, well, we hate these guys, but we don't want to deal with them, especially since they don't like the Americans very much. And then the Saudis, not necessarily the government itself, but a lot of elements within Saudi Arabia were part of the ideological and financial underpinning that made al-Qaeda possible. How do I know that? Because we allied with them back in the 80s to form the Mujahideen, which eventually became the Taliban. Anyway, so the U.S. is looking at this region, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. We're like, well, conquering any of them wouldn't be fun. Conquering all three at the same time to get after a militant group just doesn't seem like the right task. And so the solution that was struck upon was to knock over Iraq and occupy it with armored tank brigades, which is not the way you pacify a population. You want ground infantry for that. The idea is Tehran and Damascus and Riyadh, none of them thought the U.S. was going to do this. And so when it did it with tanks and left the tanks there, they're like, shit, there's nothing to stop the United States from turning on us. And while Iran was to a degree protected by its mountains and had a little bit more confidence it would be able to put up a good fight, the other two had no such confidence. And they knew that if the United States decided to come for them, that their regimes were done. Because there was no civil support. There was no technical competence. There was no cohesion. Well, it worked. And those three countries went after al-Qaeda for us. And are the primary reasons, the strategy is the primary reason, why al-Qaeda is, for all intents and purposes, no more. The problem is that we didn't declare victory and went home. We tried to make Iraq look like Wisconsin, with the results that you can imagine, because again, there's nothing to build from in terms of society. We overthrew what stable order there was and replaced it with nothing. Now, fast forward to today. The W. Bush administration felt they had no choice but to go in. And, we can debate whether it worked out well or not. First phase of the plan, I think, worked. Second phase, Obama changed nothing, despite his rhetoric. Trump said he pulled out, but left troops in places like Syria to fight ISIS because no one in the U.S. political system wants to be blamed for being the guy who allowed that militant group to come back. But here's the problem. The countries in these areas are never going to have the foundation that's necessary to form a country in the way that Americans or Westerners in general, or even Asians, see it. And so if your goal is to prevent the creation or the operation or the resurgence of a specific type of militancy, you will be there forever. And that's one of the reasons why we called them the forever wars, because we found ourselves going to war with a military tactic as opposed to any specific group. And while most of our troops are out of the region now, what happened earlier today in Syria is the best that we can hope for unless the strategy changes. We are never going to be able to turn these countries into something that we would normally recognize as a peer or as even someone in the same category as the nation states that we have in most of the rest of the world. That's not how these areas work. They never have. They don't have the economic geography to try. And so we're left with a fun little discussion we have to have. Option A is stick it out forever, do what most of our forces have been doing in the region since the operation was slimmed down under Trump, and hunker in your bases and watch. And if something like ISIS bubbles up again, hit it with a hammer, go back to your bases, and watch some more. And if you do that, you'll be there forever. And while you're there forever, other militant groups who have their own ideas of who should be in charge will take pot shots at you. And that's what we've been seeing with the Iranians being the instigators. This is the new normal. This is the old normal. This is just what the region looks like. Option 2, leave. From a casualty point of view, it's easy. We're never going to make this area look like something that we want. Danger, if you leave, is that a group that you specifically don't like is going to boil up. Now, let me put that into context. Part of the reason that we're still there is we find the tactics of ISIS beyond repute. And we've seen that replicated in Hamas in the beginning of the Gaza war. We're not going to be able to defeat a tactic. But the fear is if we leave, more of these groups will boil up in a shorter period of time and eventually start not just attacking the locals, but our interests in the region as well. The problem with that theory is that it assumes that there's something better that can happen if we stick around. Something to keep in mind. This is an area of fortress cities. And historically speaking, when you don't have an external power like the United States in, those fortress cities start to enforce their own writ on the area. Now, we have enabled Baghdad to recover from the Saddam and the occupation areas, and it's doing a pretty good job of holding its own. What we're doing against groups like ISIS is basically taking some of the unknowns out of the equation for the other two major powers in this region, which are Damascus, Syria, and Turkey. If the United States were to vanish overnight, they would have to deal with these unknowns themselves. And we would have a much more aggressive effort from both countries to deal with groups like ISIS. That is more normal. And so we're actually in this weird situation where U.S. forces that are remaining in the region, even if they're just staying in their camps, have become the single greatest reason why the government in Damascus still exists. Because under normal circumstances, other regional powers would have moved in and smashed these groups that were patrolling out of existence. And that means the Turks get more involved, that means the Syrians get more involved, and that means the Israelis get more involved. And in that sort of contest, with Mesopotamia kind of acting as an anvil, we'd probably see the end of the Syrian government within 5 years. Of course, it would be bloody and horrible, because this is a region that can barely grow food itself, and it uses a lot of those energy imports or exports to buy food that it imports. So the capacity here for an outright civilizational collapse is very, very real. And agreed, the presence of U.S. forces is one of the few things holding the darkness at bay. Now, whether that is considered an American national interest or not, talk amongst yourselves. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Kalea at the southern point of the island of Hawaii. Got the slopes of Mauna Loa behind me, the larger volcano here. I am going to take something from our Ask Peter forum. We're going to put that link here at the end of the video, too, in case you were sending your own questions. And it's, am I worried about Ukraine in the light of what has become an American boycott on weapons supplies? And yes, I am. The Ukrainians are running out of ammo. There's no way they could produce enough to support the war themselves. And the Russians have mustered a fresh human wave. And, human waves are very vulnerable to mass fire, but you have to have ammo for that to work. So there's some concerns we might be seeing a turning point in the war here in the next few weeks if something doesn't change. But what is going on is we've got a dozen, roughly, Republicans on the right who are blocking anything from happening in Congress that they don't agree with. And so this is not a Ukraine problem. This is an everything problem. These few reps are blocking anything on any issue. So we've got programs that need to be addressed, not just Ukraine, but aid for Taiwan against China, aid for Israel against Hamas. There's issues with healthcare and business reform and criminal justice reform, the defense system and the budget. Every single thing has been dropped. It's not that these folks oppose Ukraine per se, it's they oppose anything that isn't exactly their way. So I call them the Greenpeace faction of the Republican Party because they just hate everyone. This means that this Congress has been the least productive in American history. At this stage in Congress, a little bit more than halfway through their session, we've only passed about 20% of the bills that the second least productive Congress in history has passed. So this isn't an issue of big government versus small government. This is just an issue of dysfunction, and it's a problem for everybody. Now, I don't think it's going to get any better any soon. When the Republicans didn't do very well in the last midterms, the hope of getting a big majority vanished. So they had a very slim minority beginning, and they have seen that minority shrink down. In part, it's because they've cannibalized their own. This faction of Republicans forced out the former Speaker, McCarthy from California, and so he just quit. He left the House altogether, leaving that seat open. We've had another couple of resignations since, and then the Republicans purged one of their own, Republican Santos of New York, for, let me make sure I get this right, using campaign finance to purchase gay fetish foot porn. Can't make this shit up. Anywho, what it means is not just that the margin that the Republicans have in the majority has gotten smaller and smaller, it's worse than it sounds. Because to pass something in Congress, you don't need a majority of the votes, you need a majority of the seats. And so every empty seat kind of acts as a quasi-vote against the majority. So they only have the Republicans now only have a margin of 2. They can only lose 1 vote if they still want to get things passed. And that makes each individual faction, including the Greenpeace faction, more powerful. So this is going to go one of 2 ways. Number one, they're going to continue to stall everything, and this Congress will go down in history as the most pathetic ever until we have general elections a year from now, November, and the new Congress would sit in January. Or the bulk of the Republicans reach across the aisle and start cutting deals with centrist Democrats. Now, that's not as easy as it sounds. There's a lot of minutia. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of noise. And in the environment that we're in right now, anyone who reaches across the aisle is inviting a primary challenge from the freak wings of their parties, whether it's the Greenpeace faction or the Republicans or the squad version of the Democrats. So none of these are easy decisions, but they do suggest that drama in Congress is going to increase, or rather than decrease, in the months ahead. And that's not just bad for Ukraine. That's bad for everyone, except for the Chinese who think this is fantastic. All right, that's it from me. Take care. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from above the very active Kilauea volcano. That's the crater that cooked off last year. Today we're going to talk about an assault that happened last week. The Ukrainians sent a squad of drones north out of Ukraine, over Russian airspace, into the Gulf of Finland to attack the Uga-Ust, hope I pronounced that right, oil refinery and loading facility. Now, normally this wouldn't really matter because normally drones, as we've seen, can't get through any sort of meaningful air defense, but the Russian air defense in this area appears to be just as crappy as it is everywhere else in the country, so a bunch of them got through. The other reason I wouldn't normally care about this is most refineries, everyone gets all ooh and ah, they expect Hollywood explosions when a bomb goes off in a refinery. You gotta keep in mind scale here. Most refineries are over a square mile, and this one's no exception. There's a lot of standoff distance among the different facilities, so if something does blow, it doesn't blow up the whole thing. And crude oil at room temperature isn't even flammable. So the warheads that these bombs can carry, which are less than 100 pounds, probably with the models that were used, probably under 20 pounds, it's not that you can't do damage, but you can't do real damage. But this is not just a refinery. This is also a loading facility. And in a refinery, once you've made your fuels being more flammable than raw crude, you then put them into a truck or a pipe and send it away. With a port facility, you put into a big, giant tank, and then a large vessel comes by and sucks off what it needs and goes on its merry way. And so the tanks themselves are the vulnerable points here. Now, judging from the size of the explosions and the fires that were started, the tanks were not hit. That's just something that you should have in the back of your mind when you're evaluating when somebody says a refiner, a certain piece of energy infrastructure was hit, so you know what to look for. What's interesting here, two things. Number one, it took the Russians more than 3 days to put out the fire, and they put it out the wrong way, using water in, the near Arctic winter, which caused a lot of water to freeze and then expand and wreck more infrastructure. Damage assessments are still underway. We don't know how bad it was, and had this been a normal attack, we would have known within 24 hours whether or not anything substantial had been done. But here we are nearly a week out, and we still really don't have any more but the vaguest ideas, and the facility is shut down. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this matters. Number one, while the Europeans have put sanctions on seaborne crude, seaborne oil product is in a loophole. So they were still taking stuff from this facility, and with its shutdown, all of a sudden, sanctions have gone up to a whole new level, and we're going to have a very good idea of how the Europeans can absorb or not this newest change. Quick add-on, the Ukrainian attack on Ust-Luga was on Sunday the 21st, and less than 72 hours later, the Russians were able to begin shipping out again. However, what is being shipped out is primarily, well, almost exclusively, oil and something called condensate, which is kind of a raw product somewhere between natural gas and oil. The actual refining complex remains completely offline. There's no naphtha, there's no fuel, there's no intermediate products that are coming out at all. And at present, the Russians are still completing their damage assessments, and at the pace they're going, we probably won't have any information on the level of damage until probably March. And then, with their very, very thin remaining skin of skilled labor, they can start talking about repairs. Second, this is the first significant Ukrainian attack against a significant economic asset of the Russian Federation, and at least on the surface, it looks like it was much more successful than they ever thought was possible. That means that the northern parts of the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Finland are suddenly in a danger zone that is well within the Ukrainians' proven range of operation. Now, the Ukrainians and the Russians haven't really gone against civilian shipping right now, but I can't think of a better target than an oil loading and refining platform such as what we've got in Ust-Luga. Again, apologies for the inaction. We're just going to put the spelling right here so you can see what I'm having the trouble with. Okay. So this is the sort of thing we should now watch for in the future, because this is not the only facility of this type which is within the Ukrainians' reach. There are a number of facilities at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea and Tuapse on the Black Sea and closer to St. Petersburg, also on the Gulf of Finland. And now that the Ukrainians have proven that a few things can slip through, you can bet that they're going to target all of them. And all told, if you look at all of the infrastructure combined, its combined export and throughput capacity is in the vicinity of 3.5 million barrels a day, which is about 3.5% of global output. So if you put a meaningful dent in the export infrastructure, it's impossible for the Russians to shunt this stuff somewhere else. There's nowhere else to go. And so it just backs up through the system. There's also one other thing to look at. The fact that the damage control crews proved to be so incompetent is something that we're starting to see at the edges, as the Russian economic system frays. The Soviet educational system collapsed back in 1986, which means that the youngest people who are worthy of terms like engineer turned 64 this year. And so when I think of fire suppression, I think of something that normally I could not just pick up the hose and go do it. You want someone with specialized training. And especially if you're talking about petroleum, natural gas, or refined product fires, you definitely want someone who has some idea what they're doing. Russia's running out of those people. It's not just that 1 million people have fled the country and 500,000 have been drafted and committed to the war, been killed. They don't have much of a skilled labor pool left. And what they do have is being dedicated to the war itself, air defense in the vicinity of the war, or the military-industrial complex to keep the war going. So we're seeing some very serious frays with the system. This is not the sort of thing that they should have gotten wrong. That fire should have been put out very quickly with things like foam, and it wasn't. And that suggests the Russians' ability to maintain their overall system is starting to feel the strain of all of this, and they don't have a backup plan. There isn't enough labor in the country to redirect from somewhere else, especially skilled labor. All right. That's it for me. Take care. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Colorado. It is the 29th of January, and the news today is that in a drone attack, an Iranian militia operating near the border of Jordan and Syria managed to get a drone into an American base and kill 3 people in the vicinity of one of the barracks. These are the first deaths of American military personnel since the Iranians started pushing groups like the Houthis to attack Americans and international commerce in a large volume, and it's probably going to merit a response. Something to keep in mind is when the United States a couple weeks ago decided to start taking military action against the Houthis in Yemen, it wasn't because these Iranian-backed groups were attacking commerce in general. It's because they fired an anti-ship missile at a U.S. military vessel, and that's what started it all off. So working from that same logic, now that some Americans have actually died, you can expect the Biden administration to strike back. The question is how? There's kind of 3 things to consider. None of the options are great. Option number 1, you do a semi-proportionate, because the Americans always believe in overkill, assault against the militias that Iran backs either in the area in question or somewhere in the broader Middle East. The problem with this is it doesn't solve the problem. The people who are doing the attacks aren't Iranian. They're just using Iranian equipment and sometimes a little bit of Iranian intel. And even if you were to wipe them all out, they come from sectarian groups who are opposed to their local geopolitical orders. And so they tend to oppose Sunni groups who tend to be in the majority, especially in places like Jordan, or in the case of Iraq, where you have a pseudo-democracy. And in these cases, even if you were to take them all out, you just have an aggrieved minority that would, again, push people in that the Iranians would recruit. So it might make things calm down for a few weeks to months, but it's certainly not any sort of lasting solution that's going to change the logic in Tehran at all. The second option is to strike military assets in Iran proper. The idea is you go after the personnel that are making these decisions. The problem here is that there's a lot of them. Iran isn't like most strongman autocracies. You've got a ruling elite of the religious class, the mullahs, who's over 10,000 people. And even if you were to somehow magically carry out an assassination program and within 24 hours kill the top 1,000 of them, I mean, sure, they'd have some reshuffling, but it actually wouldn't disrupt the regime in any meaningful way. In addition, Iran is a series of mountains. It's basically a fortress. And if you wanted to go in there and knock the government out, you would need a force significantly larger than what the United States pushed into Iraq, which is ultimately a flat and somewhat desert community. And that means you're going over mountain range and mountain range and mountain range. So the distances are far. The logistics would be hard. The geography plays to the defender's strength. And then even if you were successful, well, then what? Are you going to stick around and try to reconstruct Iran in the way that we did Iraq? I think the U.S. learned that that's not an easy thing to do. So, and again, this wouldn't change any of the logic in Iran about what they're doing in the broader region. If anything, it would intensify it. That leaves us with the third option, which is a military option against Iran's economy. Now, Iran, while it is nowhere near the peak that it once was back in the 70s as an oil producer when it was exporting more than 4 million barrels a day, is still in the game. It still exports about 1 million barrels a day, and that income is the primary source of hard currency that the Iranians use to fund everything that they do, from purchasing social stability from their population at home to funding these rocket attacks against U.S. military targets throughout the broader region. And unfortunately for the Iranians, it all flows through a single point called Karg Island, which is on the northeast shore of the Persian Gulf. And it would be very, very, very easy for the United States just to destroy the loading facilities or maybe even the storage tanks and the pumping stations in Karg. They could probably do it with a handful of sorties. It would probably take less than an hour. Iranian missile defense is not very good. Their air defense is not very good either. And the U.S. obviously is very good at striking in those sorts of conditions, especially when you're talking about something that is on the coast, so you don't have to fly over too many defensive layers to get to it. There'd be a cost to this, of course. Should the United States decide to do this step, it would take the role of the erstwhile global guarantor of maritime security and have the United States taking very discrete shots at very specific parts of the global economy that have relied upon international security in order to function. And that means that any vessels that are part of a long supply chain, a long sail, going through a dangerous area, near a dangerous area, or have multiple supply chain steps, meaning that if you interrupt just one of them, all of them become defunct, all of that would be in danger. And that is the entire electronic supply chain in Southeast Asia and East Asia. That is the entire oil supply chain, which either is sourced from or passes through the Middle East. The consequences of that would be significant on a global basis. But if you want to take the American populist view, which is something that Biden and Trump agree on, is that a lot of that doesn't really matter. And in fact, there's something to be said for stalling those international systems because they favor North American solutions. The United States doesn't get energy from this region anymore. Canada doesn't. Mexico doesn't. So the economies that we care about the most are heavily insulated already. And the economy that we're most dependent upon or the most concerned about is China. And they get all of their energy from this region. Well, not all, but like half. And so if the Biden administration does take this step, things will very much be in motion very quickly. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan coming to you from Colorado, where we're about to get another 6 inches of snow. A lot of you have written in about the Biden administration's decision to put an operational pause pending further review on liquefied natural gas exports. There are a lot of people talking a lot of things on all sides. On the energy industry side, they're saying that this is a breach of proper protocol, and it's going to really inhibit future investments across the sector. And on the environmentalist side, they're talking about how this is the end of that sector altogether, and they're dancing and singing Kumbaya. Everybody's wrong. Let me kind of lay out what this stuff is. So natural gas is normally transported by pipe because it's difficult to move, it's difficult to store, it's difficult to produce. And so you'll have a pipe network like in North America that is separate from the pipe network in Europe, which is separate from the pipe network in China. Those are the three big ones. You got some smaller ones around the world. They don't connect, or they can't connect. And so if you want to link these together, what you need to do is have a facility on a coast that will chill the stuff down to something like negative 300 degrees or so. And then it's a liquid, and then you put it into a specially designed tanker that can handle these cryogenic fluids. And then you transport it across the ocean to another facility where it unloads and is regasified and then put into the new system. Now, we've been doing this for a few decades, but it's only in the last 15 years that it's really started to become big. And the primary reason for that is the environmental movement, because natural gas, if it's properly burned in an appropriate facility, a combined cycle natural gas plant, generates about half of the CO2 emissions of, say, a coal plant. Also, you can spin up a natural gas facility in just a few minutes, as opposed to a coal facility, which can take hours to even days. And so if you want to pair it with, say, wind and solar, it's the perfect complement fuel, because when the sun goes down or when the wind stops, you can just turn this thing on. And so if you want to get the full capacity from your wind and your solars, you really have to have a conventional system that's dispatchable like natural gas. Now, the United States currently has enough capacity, nameplate capacity, to chill and ship about 13 billion cubic feet of this stuff per day, which makes it the largest exporter in the world already. And under construction are facilities that would allow another 12 BCF per day, which, if you remove the United States' existing capacity from that, that's again the world's largest. And then there's already been stuff permitted for another 16 billion cubic feet per day. So, you add those three together and, where we are right now, that's enough to supply all of Japan. If we bring all of these online, that's almost enough to supply all of Europe. And the Biden freeze doesn't touch any of that. It is a pause of the review process for new facilities. Now, if the United States were to bring these all online, so 13 today, 12 in a few years, and down the road, maybe another 16. You're talking, 40? Yeah, it's more than 40 BCF. And that would be roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of total U.S. consumption of natural gas. If we did get the number that high, we'd have a lot more price linkage between the U.S. market and everywhere else. Remember, natural gas is pretty much sequestered, and LNG has traditionally just kind of played at the margins. But if we had this kind of volume, then Americans would start to be exposed to global natural gas prices. If that were to happen, instead of this $2 to $5 range that we've kind of become used to and is probably going to be our norm for the next few decades, we'd probably see prices regularly going above 15 or 20 as we have international price shocks because of things like, the Ukraine war, or something blowing up in the Middle East. When you only have about 10% exposure, or in our cases a little bit, 10%? Yeah, we got about 10% exposure. The price swings are very muted. And so back in 2021, when the Ukraine war was hot and heavy and we thought we were going to lose all the Russian gas at the same time, the Europeans were dealing with natural gas prices that were well over 70 for a few months, and it was pretty ugly for their industrial stuff. Anyway, let's talk about what people are talking about with this. On the industry side, the idea that we're going to build out past 40 is kind of a stretch anyway, so the oil companies are just whinging because someone's telling them that they can't do anything right now. Second, the Biden administration has not oversold this. They're saying it's a temporary pause of the review process to consider climate change. Well, if you want to consider climate change, natural gas is the perfect fuel to ship out in bulk because it's the only thing that really pairs with solar or wind. You're not going to do this with coal. That would be silly. And batteries sound great until you realize the industrial process that's required to build them at scale is never going to make them more than a niche use in specific areas. I'm not saying there's no use for them there, but natural gas is so much easier. It's so much cheaper. And by most measures, it's actually a lot cleaner too. So you're only going to put batteries in places like Phoenix maybe, where the solar intensity can be really, really high, and they just need to save some, for nights. And then on the environmental side, the celebrations, number one, this is not forever. It's a temporary pause of the review process, which the Biden administration can reverse with a stroke of a pen, or any additional leader could for reasons environmental, economic, or strategic. Remember that a lot of the stuff that's getting shipped out right now is going to Europe in order to allow the Europeans an option other than sucking down Russian gas. So, this is kind of important from that front too. So everyone's kind of making a really big deal out of it, but I think the thing that is most hilarious is that the Biden administration has found a way, again, to satisfy the environmental activists without actually changing the system. This is very similar to what he did when he came into the presidency and he put a moratorium on fracking on federal lands, and everyone was all wailing and gnashing their teeth on one side and screaming bloody delight on the other side. Well, people forget that 99% of all shale operations are on private land, and that is regulated by the states. So it was less than 1% of wells that were affected at all. But it made the environmentalists happy, and it pissed off the energy industry, but it didn't really change anything at all. And Biden is never going to be the preferred candidate of the energy industry, and he was able to placate some of his more hardcore supporters. He's now done that again. So it's a fairly savvy political move that actually moves the needle not at all, which, is one of the smarter things you can say about politics these days. Good morning from a frigid Colorado. It's a balmy 0 degrees this morning, and today I want to tell you a tale of 3 companies and the state of the semiconductor industry from a technological and production point of view. Now, if you go back to the world before 2017, the technology of the day was something called deep ultraviolet, which was basically a way of producing microchips. And Intel, the American technological giant, was the world leader by pretty much any measure. And they had gotten a little cocky and they had gotten a little bit lazy. So they would design chips 2, 3, 4 models out, but would only produce the next one up. Because they were so far ahead of everybody else, they didn't feel the need to jump steps. So they would use DUV, and they would make a chip that was marginally better than the one before. And then at the end of the year, no one had caught up, so they'd do it again and again and again. And they did this for like 15 years. I mean, they're very good at what they do, but they could have pushed the technological envelope a lot more had they chosen to. In part, that was because of the nature of DUV technology. The problem with it is you have to kind of make micro adjustments and physically adjust the equipment for each type of chip, and you have to do that manually and physically. And so with every design, you had to do it all over. And with every machine in a fabrication facility, you would have to do it independently. So no new chips from different machines are going to be quite exactly alike, and it generated a relatively higher loss rate from the final semiconductors than what we have today, and so generated a little bit more waste. But again, they were the industry leader. No one was close. Well, they were always had their eye on the future, however, and so they invested in new technologies that would take them beyond DUV, one of which is EUV, extreme ultraviolet. And the company that developed that technology is ASML out of the Netherlands. And back in 2016, ASML thought this stuff was ready to go. So they're providing demonstrations for Intel, showing them how this technology is better. You can not only get more nodes on a chip and get to smaller and smaller nanometers, but it's all digital. So you kind of type in what you want to the machine over the course of a few days to a few weeks, and then the machine doesn't actually have to be physically manipulated in the way that DUV did. Now, what that would mean is you'd have a higher success rate and more efficiency, but back in 2016, Intel was like, I don't think this technology is quite right, and we're the industry leader, we're going to give it a few more years. Well, ASML, not very happy with that, marketed the technology to everybody else, and a company decided to take the plunge. That company is TSMC out of Taiwan. And when we get to 2017, TSMC suddenly hits the ball out of the park and proves that EUV is ready for mass application, and over the next couple of years very rapidly overtakes Intel because they have a shorter turnaround time for their chips, and they can make chips with smaller nanometer sections. It isn't until 2022 or 2023 that Intel finally makes its first extreme ultraviolet chip. So TSMC in Taiwan has been the industry leader now for several years. Now, we've had a kind of a reverse in the roles now. ASML, the Dutch, have another new technology called high numerical aperture, whose physics I'm not even going to pretend to understand, and they have marketed again, and this time Intel is the one that's behind, and they're kind of desperate and kind of hungry, and TSMC is the one that's resting on their laurels. So the first delivery of those new machines, the high NA chips, went to Intel in the second week of January of this year. And Intel expects 2 things. Number one, they plan to overtake TSMC using the EUV technology in 2024, hoping to get down to 2 nanometers. Right now, the industry lead is at about 3 nanometers, and that's a TSMC product. And then next year, they hope to leapfrog even further, provided that these new high NA machines work, which we'll find out pretty soon. Anyway, that's where we are right now. In terms of the overall geopolitics, it's pretty straightforward. Right now, 90% of all IHN chips are made by one company, TSMC, in one city in Taiwan. It's a high concentration. But if Intel, working with ASML, can pull this off, all of a sudden we will have facilities in the United States that are working on the higher end stuff, with some of the first facilities that are going to be going online outside of Phoenix and Columbus, Ohio. So stay tuned, because the geography of these chips is about to evolve pretty significantly, if high NA works. And if not, we're still stuck with Taiwan. It could be worse. Everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Doubtful Sound. And in this next in our series of regional geopolitics in a post-American world, I want to talk about Northern Europe, specifically the Scandinavian region. Now, this is an area that has been fractured by history. You've got islands, you've got peninsulas, you've got de facto city-states. But while they have been powerful in the past, they've kind of been sleeping for the last 300 years. And during the Cold War and the post-Cold War era, it's been fractured into a number of different governments. But I think the best way to think about this is not so much a collection of countries, but a family of Vikings who are getting to know each other again. The original Vikings were the Danes and the Swedes, who basically went off, raided and pillaged, and founded little trading depots everywhere that they went. And some of those depots eventually rose to become significant countries in themselves. Think of Riga in Latvia, or Oslo in Norway, or Reykjavik in Iceland. But by the time we get to the modern era, they had been broken into different spheres of influence. In the post-Cold War environment, however, especially now with the Ukraine war happening, we're seeing a changing of fortunes as these countries are rediscovering each other. And we're already in an environment where a lot of them consider themselves so familial that they already have a lot of joint embassies around the world. But if there's one thing they're all concerned about, it's Russia. Denmark is the last country approaching the Baltic Sea, so that if the Russians ever make a bid to get into the open ocean, they go by them. The Norwegians control the northern coastline, so they know the North Point is something they're responsible for. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania used to be Russian colonies under the Soviet period, and Sweden is a mid-sized power that was ultimately smashed by Russian power 3 centuries ago, and only recently has kind of emerged, whereas Finland was both a Swedish territory and a Russian territory, based on which time frame you're looking at, and only really became independent in a traditional sense in the last decade or so, as it's broken away from its Finlandization programs, which were basically a way that the Soviets used to crush Finns' strategic autonomy. What we're seeing now is this whole cluster of countries coming back together, all on the same side of the same geopolitical orientation, no longer fractured by other powers, with Sweden absolutely being the center weight of all of it. It's probably best to think of most of these countries not so much as countries, but as cities that just happen to own another swath of territory. So in the case of, say, Riga or Copenhagen or Oslo, over half, in fact, almost 3/4 of the population is in that one city, and the rest of the territory just kind of hangs on. Sweden is the exception. I mean, yes, Stockholm is by far the largest, but it actually has a populated zone in the south that is agricultural. There are a number of cities going up and down the Baltic Sea coast. And so it is arguably as powerful, if not more powerful, than all of the others put together. And now that Sweden is emerging from its traditional neutrality and starting to write its own security policies, it is going to be a major force to be reckoned with. A couple things about this region to keep in mind. Number one, it is very, very naval. Because of the Baltic Sea, because of the Gulf of Bothnia, this is a zone that if they're going to survive, they have to do so in the context of having a powerful navy to keep potential rivals at bay. And that means, number two, it's actually fairly easy for them to partner with other powers from out of region, assuming for the moment that those other powers are also naval. Because if they were to partner with, say, the French or the Germans, who are primarily land powers, these countries would see themselves overwhelmed. They're just not big enough. Sweden doesn't even have 10 million people versus, say, France is roughly 60. The whole region put together can't add up to a France, much less a Germany. But if you bring in the United Kingdom, you've got a very different sort of power dynamic. And the United Kingdom, like the Swedes, like the Danes, like the Estonians, really doesn't want to see a single large mega power emerge in the Eurasian or the European space, because that would be a threat to their naval independence. And so the Brits have always gotten along spectacularly with all of the Scandinavians. And now that the Swedes and the Finns are ditching neutrality, the partnership between London and these places is very strong. To a lesser degree, the United States is in the same place. Now, the United States overall is looking to slim down its security commitments moving forward, but it doesn't take a lot of cooperation between the Americans and, say, the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians in order to achieve some outside outcomes, because all of the Scandinavians just want to maintain independence, which means they're always going to be, to a degree, hostile to anything that happens in Moscow, and to a lesser degree, continental Europe. That means for a very small price, the United States can really achieve some outsized outcomes working through some very credible partners. So we should start to think of the relationship between the Americans and the Baltics and the Norwegians and the Scandinavians, however you want to define the cluster, as very similar to the American relationship with Australia. A powerful, creative ally that punches above its weight, that's going to do its own thing for its own reason, but which dovetails with American power moving forward. All right, that's it for me. Catch you guys next time. Hey everyone, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from a very foggy Colorado. It is the 16th of February, and the news today is that Russian prison authorities have announced the death of Alexei Navalny, who was a political prisoner who had the audacity to criticize Vladimir Putin and run for office long ago, years ago, and has been in prison ever since. He was transferred about a year ago to a high-security prison in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. It was an old Soviet gulag. This is basically where the Russian government sends people when they want them to die, because it's cold, it's brutal, there's no heat, and medical service is deliberately denied. So the idea that he's dead is not exactly a shock. The Russian government very well could have actually executed him, and no one would know. Now, back in 2021, the Biden administration said the death of Navalny would trigger a collapse in international relations that would really punish the Russians. But since then, the Russians have launched a war and killed a couple 100,000 people in Ukraine. So pretty much all of these stops that could be pulled out have been pulled out. And about the only way to punish the Russians now would be to send a lot more weapons to Ukraine, or to do an outright block of all of their energy exports, neither of which on the moment, for a mix of political and economic reasons, are on deck. So I don't want to say anything weird like, the Russians are going to get away with this, because there's a lot going on, but don't expect any sort of tactical response from the Americans in general, or the West. Now, before anyone gets to crying about this, a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, Russia's not a democracy. It hasn't really been a democracy in over 20 years. So even if Navalny was allowed to continue to be part of the political conversation in Russia, it's not like he has any chance of changing policy. He was more of a personal annoyance to Putin and nothing more. There are other people within the ruling party who have decided to run for presidency against Putin on a very nationalist ticket, but just be opposed to the war, and they're not being allowed to participate either. So it really doesn't matter. It's something that pro-democracy activists in the West get really excited about because he's a name that more people know, but he was never going to have any influence. Second, careful what you wish for. Navalny may have been a nicer guy than Putin, because, low bar, but he was just as nationalist. And his biggest criticism of the Ukraine war wasn't that it was happening, but it just wasn't being prosecuted very well. People forget that the strong predilection among Russians is to continue the war. They just don't want to be part of it personally. The idea that Russia needs to expand its borders in order to survive is not one that is particularly debated in Russia. It's generally been their security policy for 400 years, that as long as your external borders are flat and open, you're not safe. So you have to go through Ukraine to get to Romania and Poland and the rest. Now, of course, that's bad for Romania and Poland and the rest, but the Russians are not misreading the map. And unfortunately, that gets wrapped up in the political discussion so that folks like Navalny appear more important than they really are. So, I feel bad for the guy and his family, but we were probably always going to get here.